So please, Professor Zhang.
Thank you, Professor Zanini. Thank you for organizing this and to inviting me over, and for Kafkaskari for hosting this colloquium. The talk I want to give today is really a part of a larger project that looks at the exchanges and cross-fertilization of ideas, of modes of production and of consumption in East Asia, starting from the mid to late 19th century onward until, I guess, more or less contemporary period. And it's a project born out of interest in tea. So I am a tea addict, unlike Zhang, who is not. I am actually interested in drinking tea, and so that's what got me into this mess in the first place. Today, the talk is about a slightly almost old-fashioned topic, sort of a Bankian impact response model even. And it's looking at the response of the East Asian tea industries to the rise of foreign competition starting in the early 20th century, or really starting in the late 19th century. To give you a little bit of context, if we look at, this is a tea export by country in pounds. The data is from a report by Japanese colonial officials in Taiwan in the 1930s. If this chart goes further up in time, further back in time, let's say 1840 or 1850, China would basically be the only column on the list. Nobody else was exporting tea at the time. But by 1896 or 1900, you see that India and Ceylon, or Sri Lanka, have already exceeded China in terms of tea production and export volume. Japan was a relative latecomer to the export, smaller scale, but also a more niche product. They basically only made green tea. And so relatively actually a little less affected. And then you have Taiwan, and then later the rise of Java also as another competitor. And these were the sort of the major exporters. There were some other minor players as well, but those didn't really make it onto this list and not really necessary. And you see there was sort of the figures for India and Ceylon were basically rising pretty rapidly through the first few decades of the 20th century, with India's production more than 2.5 times, and Ceylon as well, more than 2.5 times of the starting point on this chart. Whereas in China, the export volumes by the 1930s was 40% of what it was around 1900. And Japan has also dipped a bit, and so has Taiwan, although not as severely. This was a combination of various factors. One was simply the more desired product that was being made by South Asia at the time, and also changing trade policies, and especially around the time of the First World War. So does this work? Laser. There. Especially if you look at 1915 and 1920, what happened with this precipitous drop in all three East Asian producers' numbers is that a combination of the First World War and the economic sort of depression that followed, and the exit from the global market of Russia as a major importer of tea caused a major crisis in the world tea market. One of the things that the British government did in response was to impose more tariffs on tea from countries that were not a British colony. And so when most of your tea is being sold through auction in London, that caused a major problem for tea exporters in East Asia. So the combination of trade policies and economic depression and so on was really sort of challenged these East Asian tea industries in a very fundamental way. And more looking at it more broadly, we are looking at I think it's one of the actual earliest examples of the rise of what we can now call an agribusiness, a vertically integrated business that controlled everything from plantation to marketing to sale to final point of sale, versus a smallholder sort of economic model. where you have small-scale tea farms owned by individual farmers producing on a relatively low-tech and low-efficiency level. And the result was not that pretty for these smallholders. You have, on the one hand, people like companies like Lipton that own large-scale plantations using slave-like labor producing at very low cost, and also at with a very good sort of track record of product quality assurance. On the one hand, due to its centrally controlled production processes and facilities. And on the other, you have, this is a little bit earlier, a little bit predates my paper here, China's tea processing in 1885, but things hadn't really changed by the early 20th century, of small-scale farmers making tea, usually on plots that were no more than what a farmer could handle with his family. And sometimes even as a sort of side business. So, you would be planting something else, and well, you have this slope in the backyard. What do you do with it? You plant some tea leaves, and you make tea with it. That's all fine when you're the only exporter in the world market, and there was going to be people buying your tea regardless of what it looked like. But when you have competition that looked like the Lipton tea plantations, that really doesn't work anymore. And China's, especially China, the exports really suffered as a result. And there was a lot of collective hand-wringing in terms of how do we handle this problem? How do we sort of reform and reorganize the industry so that tea export, which was a major contributor to foreign currency sort of income, how do you sort of make it work in this kind of context without, say, fundamentally changing things around, like confiscating all the farms and making a collective farm or something like that, because that would be socially and politically untenable. I'm going to be mostly focusing on Taiwan here today, just for the interest of time, but I should put this in context in that what Taiwan was doing in the 19-teens, Japan was doing earlier in the late Meiji period, and then China was trying to do in the 1920s and 30s. And the models and the solutions were broadly similar because the circumstances were broadly similar, although of course there are regional differences as well. And the proposals that were being introduced by Japanese colonial officials in around 1915 in Taiwan, a time when the Japanese government started to really take an interest in raising productivity of this new colony of theirs, was manifold. You see a list here, and I'll sort of go through each of them quickly. Improving existing tea farm is a sort of very broad general term, but what they're really talking about is improving things like cultivation techniques, teaching farmers how to plant the teas properly. One of the persistent problems at the time was that the plants were planted in a sort of haphazard sort of way. There's a plot of land here, well, I'll plant some tea trees here. Without much technical knowledge, they didn't know how dense the plants should be in terms of planted, how they should be planted, what kind of soil should be planted in, how to take care of them, how to manage them sort of on a day-to-day basis. And to go with that, there was also a varietal problem. Farmers were not always aware of precisely what kind of variety of tea they were planting. And that might not sound like a big problem because, oh, well, all tea trees are the same genetic sort of genus, right? But in actual practical terms, there was a significant difference between these varietals. Some varietals mature a little earlier, some mature a little later. Some are ready for harvest at different times. Different varietals might have different requirements for when you process them. If your farm, which is already small to start with, has 2 or 3 different varietals, but you only really have the labor and the time to harvest in one go, and you process all your tea in one go, what that would lead to is uneven processing and uneven product. What you're talking about is, some teas might be undercooked, others might be overcooked, or harvested too early or too late. And that's going to lead to an inferior tea when it comes to the consumers. Expanding tea production area, I think that's pretty simple and straightforward. And then looking at controlling and improving tea processing techniques, and this goes hand in hand with what I talk about in terms of improving varietals. There's also other things like teaching farmers how to save money in cost-saving measures, how to improve in procurement procedures in terms of the whole infrastructure of the tea industry, improving things like transportation, and also how tea is being taken to the market and then sold, and then making sure that there's enough money and financing for farmers and merchants alike so that they can expand their business as necessary, and finally on how to how to gain market share overseas. In practical terms, these kinds of recommendations led to a whole variety of initiatives on the colonial government's behalf in trying to improve and engage farmers and trying to get them to do sort of the right thing so that overall productivity for the industry would increase over time. This is, again, remember, the other option would be the nuclear option, try to collectivize all these farms in some way or force them into some kind of collective or whatnot. It seems like the colonial government didn't really want to go that far, and instead tried various sort of initiatives and incentives to make this happen. One of the first things they did was to set up these tea research stations, which were modeled on similar stations already existing in Japan, and then I think finally from British India, where you hire a bunch of people who are experts in horticulture and whatnot, and try to figure out what is the best way of planting tea here in Taiwan, in Japan, in whatever situation you might be in. In fact, there were multiple tea stations set up in Taiwan for this purpose because there are different regions and with different climates and different kind of products at the end. And the contribution of these technicians was not limited to a sort of technical side of things. Of course, they sort of figured out, what's the maximum or the optimal density of plants and whatnot. But it's also a question of dissemination. How do you get this information, and how do you get this? Let's say you invented a new tea varietal that's more frost resistant, more productive, easier to take care of, easier to process. How do you get these to the farmers? And these tea research stations, therefore, not only serve a research function, but also serve an educational and administrative function as well by trying to let's say they came up with a new varietal, they would actually encourage farmers to uproot their old plants and plant new ones by giving them free seedlings, or by opening classes so that farmers' descendants can take these basic tea processing classes so that they learn the latest and greatest in how to make better tea on the farm. Because one of the challenges is that with a smallholding economy and a smallholding model, the tea that's harvested on farms is first processed by the farmer and, well, usually his immediate family. And the initial processing is crucial in determining the quality of the tea in the future. But since there's no transportation network, you can't bring it to a central location to do this. There is no such place. You can't bring it, 50, 100 miles away. You have to do it on the spot because it's a time-sensitive issue. And so teaching the farmers how to do this properly is of crucial significance, and the tea research stations serve this purpose as well. This obviously costs money and also takes time to invest in a staff that is capable of dealing with this. There's the additional complication of, Japanese officials and local farmers who may not be able to communicate properly, so you also need a crop of people who can sort of deal with that. And it's, I think, quite telling that you have, for example, this one memorial here at the Yuchi Tea Research Station, which still exists today, built on the foundation that was done by the Japanese during the colonial period. A memorial for this Japanese technician called Arai Kokichiro. And this was a stele set up at this tea research station in 1949. a time when the Japanese colonial memory was not particularly favored. This is not something set up in 1989 when you might expect a little bit more of this sort of nostalgia. This was in 1949. So this is the time when they already recognized, people in the tea industry itself already recognized that these technicians sort of did a good thing in terms of helping Taiwan along in the market. Another thing that is a challenge for any kind of small holding farming model, especially one that is skill intensive like tea, is how do you get people to share? How do you get people to share best practices? This is a conundrum because smallholding farmers like this sold to middlemen who then, would buy the tea leaves that they have already processed and then took them to big wholesalers and then take them to big cities and so on. They were price takers. You don't really have an ability to negotiate. The only any sort of leverage that you might have is if your tea is better than everyone else's, right? So that becomes a tricky problem. If my tea is better than everyone else's and I can sell for more, I have no incentive to teach my neighbors how to make better tea. Because if all my neighbors start making better tea as well, then mine is no longer special, and I'm economically actually disincentivized to share that knowledge. And that's a tricky thing to solve. One of the things the colonial government did, and they were already doing this in Japan earlier, was to set up these tea competitions, where winners were rewarded basically by being able to sell their tea for a high price and also becoming more famous and whatnot. And in this particular case, we have a story of a tea that was scored over 300 points in whatever metric they were using, and during one of these competitions, and it was sold. Sorry, I made a mistake in my subtitle or my caption here. Is 100 jin per for 1,000 yen and not 1,000 yen per jin. My mistake. But what this was way more than what a normal tea was being sold at the time. Is something like 100 times more, if I remember correctly. So this was a sort of astronomical price already, and what this tea was what we now know as 东方美人 or Oriental Beauty. Oriental Beauty's name in Taiwanese dialect is actually braggart's tea, 东风得. And the story that you keep reading if you go online and you read up stories about Oriental Beauty is that, oh yeah, there's a farmer in Puli and Beipu, who sold his tea for so much money. People think he was lying and bragging about it. Well, this is actually the sort of printed evidence of this actually happening. There was such a guy, and his name was Zhang. And not only was Zhang becoming famous after this competition where his tea sold for an astronomical price, he was hired as an instructor to teach other people how to make this tea. So what you have is you identify the talent through these competitions, and then you directly hire them, you pay them basically to teach other people. So all of a sudden that economic disincentive to share knowledge is gone, right? Instead you are incentivized to share that knowledge. And that's, I think, crucial in sort of promoting best practices when you have so many different players in the marketplace. Another issue is, of course, cost. Cost is a perennial problem in the East Asian tea industry. One of the things you keep seeing in these reports from Japan, from Taiwan, from China, was that how much cheaper per acre, how much cheaper per kilo or per pound that South Asia was producing their tea compared to what we were doing, and how much more productive their farms were in terms of the unit produced per acre. One of the bottlenecks was machinery. When everything was done by hand, you can imagine there's a limit to human sort of labor, right? You can only roll tea for so many hours a day before your arms get tired or your legs get tired. You can only sort of handle the heat and the intense sort of work hours, especially in Taiwan where you're producing oolong. And during oolong harvest season, you're up all night because you have to watch the fermentation process. And then you have to roll the tea at like 4 a.m. That's sort of a normal production cycle. And so producing tea without machinery in this day and age was very difficult, and costs were therefore very high. And it's also difficult to ensure consistency as a result. But no farmer can afford this stuff, right? Small-holding farmers with a small plot of land is not going to buy a rolling machine for the tea. That's just not practical. One of the things that the colonial government then therefore did was to organize farmers, to get them to organize themselves, although I think there was plenty of unspoken coercion there, into farmers' collectives for different villages or different production areas. And these collectives would then get subsidies from the government to buy machinery. And that would then be shared among farmers in the area so that they can use technology that was available at the time that was suited for their tea for production purposes. The later Chiang Kai-shek government did the same thing, basically, and imported machinery in Taiwan as well. The photo here is of a black tea factory that was set up first by the Japanese and then later taken over by the KMT. And these machineries are still existing there, although I think they're no longer really in production, only really for show now. Finally, there's an organizational issue. When we talk about the logistics of the tea market, you have basically producers right here, and then through all these different kinds of middlemen, finally to an exporter at the end. One of the perennial issues was that there were too many hands for whom these teas passed through, and everyone taking a cut, which meant that by the time it actually even gets to the wholesaler and gets to the exporter, the cost was already very high. And how do you lower that cost? Well, by having these farmers collective, you can sort of cut out some of these middlemen, these sort of mountain merchants who then walked around the mountains literally collecting leaves from each individual farmer. Instead, you had the farmer bring down the leaves to these farmers collective. The collective would hire people, porters and whatnot, to actually do the transportation. And the collective would then directly sell to tea merchants in major cities who would then further process it and then package it and sell it. So cutting out middleman was also an important bit. And of course, finally, there's overseas promotion that you saw that there was actively done by the government at the time. Yeah. Now, what we're seeing is, I think, a response by, at least in this case, in what I just outlined for you in Taiwan, of how a combination of government initiative and I think willingness on the part of the farmers to cooperate, because they want to see their stuff sell too, and they were feeling the pinch as well. And they would voice their complaints or issues through farmers' collectives or through various other channels. There were a few trade magazines where they can write in and write articles about, what's plaguing the tea industry now and what their views were. And this sort of combination of government and farmers, I think, really at least stabilized the Taiwanese tea industry. I wouldn't say it sort of skyrocketed, but there were other factors at play that I think made things a little more complicated, such as war with China in 1933. Another thing that we were seeing was that China was at the time also trying to learn from these experiences. But here you have a case where between the revolution in 1911, warlordism basically splitting the country into multiple bits throughout the 19-teens and 20s until 1927, and even after 1927, central control was not terribly effective. And then starting in 1933-34, persistent conflict with Japan. All of these combined to sort of shortcut a lot of, or not shortcut, maybe short circuit, I guess, maybe more like, government initiatives to try to reform the industry. There were many attempts that we can see in Ximen in Anhui province and also in Fujian province of the local governments trying something along these lines, setting up tea research stations, setting up experimental farms, trying to get farmers to organize into some kind of collective. But none of these sort of panned out because of these problems. But it's clear that they were trying to learn from this model. And then you have the Second World War, and then the communist, the Civil War, and then the communist takeover, which changed the trajectory of everything. But in a funny way, what we have now, after decollectivization in the 80s, is a return back to this model. And in fact, what we see now in Japan and Taiwan, and to a great extent mainland China, is a legacy of these early reforms in the 20th century. That sort of there's a shared commonality here that I think is often overlooked when we talk about the industry today, when we see literature on this. And so maybe by way of a very quick conclusion, so I think this is one of these like I said, earliest cases of agribusiness and smallholders, and I'm not sure how to frame this further, but I think there's something there. And we see in East Asia a sort of shared sort of cross-fertilization of organizational solutions, because the Japanese reformers in the late 19th century were actually writing reports on why did the Chinese tea industry fail, and they were still writing these reports in the 1920s saying, why did the Chinese tea industry fail? So they're learning, but as a sort of a negative example. And there's also sort of seeds from South Asia when appropriate, trying to bring in experts from British India, trying to bring in plants from Ceylon and British India, and trying to make it work there. In some cases, it kind of worked in Taiwan, for example. In some cases, I think Japan also tried a hand at black tea, but I don't think that ever really went anywhere. Anyway, I think my time's up, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang, for your very interesting and detailed presentation about the